Hey comrades, and welcome back to class. This is the 8th class of Liberation School's course on Volume 1 of Marx's Capital. I'm Marisa Lee Sanchez, a PSL organizer in New York City and member of the Liberation School Editorial Collective. The PSL has been hosting this course on Capital because we know that while many activists and organizers want to read the text, doing so can often feel like a daunting process. And while there are many resources out there, most of them are coming from an academic perspective rather than those who are thinking about the day-to-day concerns of organizers in the struggle. And so we wanted to do this collective reading from our perspective, the perspective of those who are committed to advancing the worldwide struggle for socialism and liberation. In today's class, we'll be covering chapter 25 of the book, where Marx synthesizes the work he's done throughout the volume in order to articulate some of the general tendencies of capitalist accumulation. And just as our usual reminder, the slideshows do refer to 3 different versions. The first being the online version, the second, the international publishers version, and the third, the Penguin version. So without further ado, I will go ahead and turn it over to Derek Ford. Derek is a PSL member in Indianapolis and editor of Liberation School. All right, welcome, Derek.
Thanks, Melissa, and welcome, comrades, to Class 8. We'll be talking about Chapter 25, finishing Part 7 of the book. Let me share my screen with you quickly. So before we begin, just to revisit the assumptions that Marx elaborated at the beginning of Part 7, in terms of what capitalist circulation is, it's when the capitalist buys means of production and labor power, and then production happens. So the value is increased, augmented, and the resulting commodity has more value than the means of production, raw materials, and labor power that went into producing it. And then the commodities with augmented value are then put into circulation and sold. Once the value of the new commodity is realized in money, we return to step 1. And a capitalist accumulation is when at least part of the surplus value produced is reinvested in the next production cycle. And so remember, that's the difference between simple circulation and the accumulation of capital. So Marx is generally assuming in this that circulation happens without interruption. So in other words, the capitalist can always find means of production, the raw materials, the labor power on the market. Commodities are trading at their values, and the commodities are sold. There's not a problem selling them. The surplus value is also all profit for the capitalist. So in other words, the surplus value is different than profit in that profit is usually less than surplus value because the surplus value produced has to also go to pay rent, taxes, so on and so forth. So with chapter 25, Marx begins by introducing a couple of different ways to look at how capital is composed. So the first one is the technical composition, and this is the ratio of means of production to labor power. And it's technical, or it's material, because it's about the numbers. So it's like the numbers of workers and the number of machines, for example. Right? The value composition is the ratio of constant capital to variable capital. So it's a different way of looking at the technical composition because it's about value and not just numbers. Because value is a dynamic social relation, it changes, right? And when we're just looking at numbers, we can't really see that. The third one he introduces is the organic composition of capital, which is also the value composition, but as determined by changes in the technical composition. So in other words, the value composition changes as the numerical ratio of workers and means of production changes. And so, for example, as more machines are employed and fewer workers are employed. And the thing here is that, there's other ways that the value composition can change, right? I mean, weather, struggles over labor power are just some of the examples. So the compositions of capital can vary within and between firms, with industries as a whole, and also with the total social capital. And that's what we're really looking at here, as a total social capital. And the accumulation of total social capital, it's not just about the accumulation of money, it's about the reproduction of the capital-labor relation, or the class relation, on an expanding scale. And so the growth of capital always has to involve a growth in either constant capital or variable capital, or both, okay? And if the composition of CV remains the same, but there's a growth in capital, then there's going to be an increased need for labor power. So accumulation of capital is therefore increase of the proletariat on this model. And this is really the first model that Marx looks at, is when there's growth, but there's a constant value composition of capital. So in other words, as capital grows, the ratio of the investment into labor power and means of production remains the same. So this is the most favorable kind of growth for workers, because variable capital increases at the same rate, right? So there's an increased demand for labor power. So wages can potentially rise because capitalists are competing for the available existing lot of workers. The price of labor power rises, but this doesn't change the characteristics of capitalism or the class relation, right? So in other words, just because wages are rising, it doesn't augment, or it doesn't, degrade the class relation that is the definition of capital, really. Instead, Marx notes, a rise in the price of labor as a consequence of accumulation of capital only means, in fact, that the length and weight of the golden chain the wage worker has already forged for himself allows for a relaxation of the tension of it, right? Sorry, there's a little bit of an error there. I should have edited that out. But the main thing here is that it doesn't, just because wages rise doesn't mean that the capitalism has changed in any fundamental way. Necessary labor time can never equal the entire working day. So a necessary labor time is basically the wage, right? Because production of surplus value is the absolute law of this mode of production. So in this case of constant, the ratio of constant and variable capital remaining the same, the price of labor power can continue to rise so long as it doesn't inhibit accumulation, right? So profits of capital can increase at the same time as wages. At some point, however, accumulation slackens in consequence of the rise in the price of labor power. So there's a crisis, both for capitalists and also for workers. And this results in unemployment, lower wages, and slower or no growth of capital. It can also, of course, present an opportunity for rebellion. So note that Marx here says that the production of surplus value is the absolute law of this mode of production. Section 2 is a different model, and here there's a relative diminution or reduction of variable capital. So in other words, constant capital, the investment in means of production in raw materials, grows more than investment in labor power or constant capital. So capitalism, as we've talked about, increases the productivity of labor, and this becomes the most powerful lever of accumulation. So what's happening here is that the technical composition of capital increases, but it increases more than the value composition because of the increasing productivity of labor. And then as labor productivity, or the rate at which workers turn means of production and raw materials into commodities, increases, there's more raw materials used. There's also an increase in machinery, means of production concentrated in buildings, furnaces, means of transport, and so on. So the result is that constant capital increases more than variable capital, and that more is produced with less labor power employed. And if therefore a certain degree of accumulation of capital appears as a condition of the specifically capitalist mode of production, the latter causes conversely an accelerated accumulation of capital. And we're going to get into these different ways right here. Concentration and centralization. So the concentration of capital is of an absolute nature, and it occurs when new capital is accumulated. So the concentration of capital, Marx says, widens the basis of production. And this is limited by the total social capital available and transformed by the creation and division of capitals. So in other words, it's when capital as a whole is expanding absolutely. For example, expanding into new territories of production, taking over domestic production or artisanal production, or, you know, the, I don't know, like cooperatives or something like that. The centralization of capital is relative, and it occurs when existing capital is reconfigured, right, and centralized. So it's the expropriation of capitalist by capitalist, or the transformation of many small capitals into few large capitals. Marx talks about a few ways, a few tendencies in centralization. So one is that it happens by cheapening commodities, so increasing the productivity of labor, which drives smaller capitals out of business, and then they can be absorbed. As capitalism develops, so too do the initial costs of entry. Right? So smaller capitals go to new spheres of production, or those not yet subjected to capital, where they compete amongst each other and then eventually lose to bigger capitals when capital goes in, when the bigger capitals go into that realm, right? So there's a kind of like cyclical process where small, maybe independent capitalists venture into a new realm of production, and then other small ones go in because they can afford to go in. And then at some point, the larger capitals can go in and sort of take them over. The third way is the credit system or joint stock companies, which Marx takes up in volume 3. It's really mentioned here and then sort of disregarded. Engels does add a footnote that indicates that English and American trusts are striving to attain this goal by basically creating monopolies through credit and joint stock companies. Marx says that that the centralization of capital, so in other words, existing capitals that are dispersed among many, being centralized into a few capitals, completes the work of accumulation by enabling industrial capitalists to extend the scale of their operations. It also makes large-scale projects that happen over a long time possible, and thus, that realize their values over many years. And centralization happens much more quickly generally than concentration. And at the end, he says that this is the starting point for a more comprehensive organization of the collective work of many, for a wider development of the material motive forces. In other words, for the progressive transformation of isolated processes of production carried on by customary methods into processes of production socially combined and scientifically arranged. So Marx is signaling here the ways in which really both the concentration and the centralization of capital provide the material foundations for communism. So we can note again the emphasis on social combination and scientific arrangement, i.e. planning. And so again, we've talked about this several times throughout the course, but this is another moment to draw it out where we see different sort of trends or different emphases that Marx puts on the definitions of communism in the book. On the one hand, in chapter 1, we saw emphasized like the free development of individuals, talked about, sort of realizing the capacities of our species being. And as we read in chapter 2, the full development of every individual, chapter 24, the full and free development of every individual. But on the other hand, communism entails a need for centralized planning, right? There isn't that much in this volume about centralized planning. This is mostly found in the second volume, right? So there are a few pages in volume 1 where we get an emphasis on this. But they're dialectically related, right? And that there's a tension or a contradiction, but also a unity between them as each depends on the other. So really part of the communist project historically has been navigating this dialectic, right? And communist agitation is to present this tension and show the internal relations of the two, that the free and full development of our collectivity doesn't happen on purely an individual basis, but it happens through actually collective centralized planning, right? And this is important because oftentimes it's really only the former that is emphasized in some Marxist, analysis and agitation. And a lot of the anti-communist Marxism really comes from this, right? So looking at actually existing socialist states and then judging it purely by the metrics of, realizing the free and full capacities of every individual outside of the necessary relationship between planning, centralization, and the application, the overall organization of labor. In section 3, Marx talks about the progressive production of a relative surplus population or industrial reserve army. And in this, there's a polemic against Malthus. And Malthus was someone who the bourgeoisie relied on because his theories really enforced bourgeois conceptions about population. He said that crises were caused by more production than can be realized, right, as well as rising wages. And he said that rising wages led workers to having more children, which resulted would exacerbate the supply of labor power and decrease wages, thereby creating a glut. So basically, he blamed workers, for their own poverty as a result of having more children. So workers were the ones to blame for the crisis, and if they just, didn't have as many kids, then there wouldn't be a problem, right? So it was utilized by the bourgeoisie because it was an argument against increasing wages, and we can see this manifested today in particular segments of the environmentalist movement, for example, that emphasize, overpopulation in sort of abstract terms as the cause of pollution or, pollution caused by producing too many commodities, right? And the discrepancy between like the number of people who have to be fed and the availability of food, for example. I don't know. Obviously, that doesn't hold, and we'll see what Marx's response is to that. Marx says that every mode of production has its own peculiar laws of population. So for capitalism, it depends on changes in the composition of capital. It's not about absolute growth, which is what Malthus was talking about. Instead, it's about the increase in the variable component means increasing demand for labor power, and decrease in the variable component means decrease in the demand for labor power, right? And these fluctuate, but the main thing is it's not about the absolute growth of the population, it's about the reduction of capital's demand for labor power as a result of the absolute law of capitalist accumulation, right? So overpopulation isn't something that's abstract or absolute, it's relative, and it's conditioned by the mode of production, right? And it's actually produced by the mode of production. I mean, overpopulation implies that there's an ideal population, but Malthus is really talking about an ideal population for capital, not for workers. So there's a hint here at what a communist law of population would be, and it would be guided by the needs of workers and not capital. Basically, it wouldn't be produced by capital's demand for labor power as it fluctuates, but it would be produced by the workers' needs and desires, for example. And then Marx notes that as capital accumulates in magnitude, i.e. in absolute terms, the changes in composition are more profound. So the laboring population, he writes, therefore produces, along with the accumulation of capital produced by it, the means by which it itself is made relatively superfluous, is turned into a relative surplus population, and it does this to an always increasing extent. This is a law of population peculiar to the capitalist mode of production, and in fact, every special historical mode of production has its own special laws of population, historically valid within its limits alone. And remember that when Marx talks about laws, he's really talking about tendencies, so they're not things that are, sort of hard and fast and deterministic or mechanistically applied, right? They're tendencies. They can go in different directions. And they're obviously subject to the class struggle, right? Just like the value of labor power is. And then we get into the industrial reserve army, the causes and the consequences. its relationship to capital. So a population of surplus workers is produced by capitalist accumulation, and this surplus population, Marx writes, becomes the lever of capitalistic accumulation, nay, a condition of existence of the capitalist mode of production. So the production of an industrial reserve army that results from a decreased demand for labor power enables capital to further gain its control and its ability to command the working class as a whole, right? And remember from the last class that even when workers aren't working, when they're unemployed or when they're unwaged, they're still subordinated to capital and still part of capital, right? So the unemployed, therefore, are part of the working class and the class struggle. And I think that this is clear in this chapter of Capital. And so I think this is important because, I can really help us speak back to the critiques of the idea that Marx is only, concerned about like particular forms of productive labor, and that's only where the potential for resistance lie. As capital grows absolutely, it becomes more elastic, right? So the crises become more profound, and it can rapidly subject other branches of production to its logic or create new branches of production. So in the latter case, there has to be the possibility of throwing great masses of people suddenly on the decisive points without injury to the scale of production in other spheres. And overpopulation supplies these masses. So the industrial reserve army has to always be ready there for capital in order for capital to enter into new territories and to expand. But on the other hand, as capital accumulates within these new branches of production, the variable constituent will fall again, and so too will the demand for labor power, right? So there's different, as we said, different industries have different compositions of capital, and generally new industries that aren't yet really subjected to capital have more variable capital in the composition than do those that are really subjected. Because if we remember, the difference between formal and real subjection is that formal subjection is when capital takes an industry as it finds it, it extends the working day, but real subjection is when capital reconfigures the working day by reducing necessary labor time and therefore reducing the need for labor power, right? In addition to reducing wages. So further, with the increase in surplus population, those who are employed can be forced to work more and or work for less because of the threat of unemployment. And the overall fluctuation of wages corresponds to the expansion and contraction of the industrial reserve army, and these again correspond to the periodic changes of the industrial cycle. They are therefore not determined by the variations of the absolute number of the working population, which is what Malthus was talking about. Right? And Marx notes that this latter case would be a beautiful law because capital would be dependent on population, right? When in effect, capitalism has a law of population. So, yeah, I guess that's all I want to say here. Section 4, we look at the different forms of the relative surplus population and the general law of capitalistic accumulation. So there's 3 forms of surplus population that Marx defines here. The first is floating workers. So these are workers who are out of work for a period due to the, being fired because of the changing value composition in a particular industry or a particular firm, or the total social capital. So they're thrown out of work, but they're looking for work. There's the latent, so those who aren't yet workers or aren't yet proletarianized, but have been thrown out of work and have yet to be absorbed by industry. So Marx is obviously writing about peasants at this time, peasants who have been driven off the land, but they haven't yet found work, but they could be workers. We could also think today about small business owners, the self-employed, and certain, who are driven out of business and forced to enter the labor market, right? We could also think about, independent pharmacies or independent, doctors who have their own practices, who are then forced out of work due to competition, and then they're forced to enter the labor market. And then there's the stagnant, or those with extremely irregular employment or with no employment. And the lives of workers in this category sink below the average normal level of the working class. This class itself has a couple of categories. Marx writes about 3 of them. First, there's those who can work. There's those like orphans and pauper children who could work if capital demanded them. There's those who can't work according to capital's demands, so the elderly or the disabled. And of course, these categories are themselves produced by capitalism. There's nothing, disability, for example, isn't biologically determined, it's socially determined, and it's determined by, under capitalism, the capitalist mode of production, right? So capital has this demand for labor power, and if your body or any element of your body, like your mind, isn't able to conform to that, then you are labeled disabled, right? Disability is produced by capitalism. Marx here excludes vagabonds, criminals, prostitutes, in a word, the dangerous classes, because these classes don't enter into the workforce. And this is why they're dangerous to capital, right? Because they sort of exist, outside of it in some sense. And there's nothing in here that excludes the possibility or importance of the struggle of the dangerous classes or the industrial reserve army as a whole, right? And so this is important because the industrial reserve army is also part of the working class. So again, I think we really see here an expansive definition of the working class. And again, this is important for really addressing and speaking back to some of the more superficial critiques of Marxism, that it's only interested in the industrial male factory worker, for example. Because even here, when Marx is clearly interested primarily in industrial work, although he's also mentioned the ways that this is not just white males, and also how this is intricately and irreversibly bound up in slavery and colonialism, that there's not a restrictive definition in terms of like what forms of labor and what kinds of workers Marxists are interested in, and what kinds and forms of workers have the potential to resist and overthrow capitalism. The other thing is that all these categories themselves have different subcategories, Marx says. Here we get to the absolute general law of capitalist accumulation. Earlier, Marx talked about the absolute law of capitalist accumulation, but now we get to the absolute general law of capitalist accumulation. And this is a quote: "The greater the social wealth, the functioning of capital, the extent and energy of its growth, and therefore also the absolute mass of the proletariat and the productiveness of labor, the greater is the industrial reserve army. The same causes which develop the expansive power of capital develop also the labor power at its disposal." So capital, again, is not just about the accumulation of money, it's about the accumulation and the strengthening of the class relation and the working class as a whole, its subjection to and domination by capital. The relative mass of the industrial reserve army increases, therefore, with the potential energy of wealth. But the greater this reserve army in proportion to the active labor army, the greater is the mass of consolidated surplus population, whose misery is an inverse ratio to its torment of labor. The more extensive, finally, the Lazarus layers of the working class and the industrial reserve army, the greater is official pauperism, poverty. This is the absolute general law of capitalist accumulation. Importantly here, Marx immediately says, like all other laws, it is modified in its working by many circumstances, the analysis of which does not concern us here, right? So, in other words, right, as Marx says later, as capital accumulates, the productivity of labor grows, the constant part of the value and organic composition of capital shrinks, and excuse me, the constant part grows and workers become more precarious. And this is, as he writes later, the accumulation of wealth at one pole being the accumulation of misery at the other pole, which is, you know, a quote that many of you have probably come across or will come across. But again, you know, Marx immediately qualifies this law, and he says, like all laws, this is subject to a range of other determinants. So it doesn't operate in a deterministic or mechanistic way, right? Obviously, the class struggle can modify how this law operates, but the ability of capital's logics to be modified applies not only for the absolute general law of capitalist accumulation, but all the laws and tendencies that Marx is writing about, right? And this is, I think, important because it's often missed when reading Marx, that laws here are not meant as hard and fast, but as contingent on a host of elements. And if you think about the application of laws in the United States, for example, you can see that just because there's a law, it doesn't mean that it's applied equally, and it doesn't mean that social forces can't, you know, intervene in its application, right, and modify it. In section 5, Marx illustrates, provides some illustrations of the general law of capitalist accumulation. Interesting, not the absolutely general law and how it plays out in different scenarios. The sources here are mostly from government figures. So a couple of trends here. First, pauperism increases in general as capitalist accumulation does. It also fluctuates with economic cycles, right? The official statistics also become more and more misleading as to the actual extent of pauperism in proportion as with the accumulation of capital, the class struggle, and therefore the class consciousness of workers develop. So the official statistics, in other words, can be manipulated. So we see this all the time with the unemployment statistics that the Department of the Bureau of Labor releases. We have a great article on Liberation School. I'll try to remember to link it to the, or on Liberation News. I'll try to remember to link it to this class page on Liberation School. And I think the headline is something like, you know, there's as many ways to for the capitalists to measure unemployment as there are unemployed people, right? And this is kind of what Marx is getting at, right? That that there's all sorts of ways that you can manipulate these statistics to make it seem like it's not so bad, and therefore to maybe inhibit or hold back class consciousness from developing. And that obviously becomes an important point in agitation, propaganda, and struggle. He talks about the housing of the poor overall, right? And basically he's talking about gentrification, right? Improvements of towns, improvements is in quotations here, accompanying the increase of wealth by the demolition of badly built quarters, the erection of palaces for banks and warehouses, the widening of streets for business traffic, for the carriages of luxury, and for the introduction of tramways, drive away the poor into even worse and more crowded hiding places. On the other hand, everyone knows that the dearness of dwellings is an inverse ratio to their excellence, and that the mines of misery are exploited by house speculators with more profit or less cost than ever were the mines of Potosi. So basically, the more capital accumulates in industrial or commercial town, the more rapidly flows the stream of exploitable human material, the more miserable are the improvised dwellings of laborers. And you can think about this in terms of urbanization. In the same way that capital expands to take over new industries or new areas of life, or public services, for example, it also goes to where the rate of profit is highest geographically, right? And so as an urban center develops or a suburban center develops, any geographic area develops, there's an influx of capital there. The poor are driven out. There's, palaces for banks erected, there's stadiums erected, high-rise condos and so on and so forth. But, at some point, capital becomes too concentrated there, and so the rate of profit falls, and so capital flees, right? And then there's a wave of sort of disinvestment from those areas. This is something, I don't know if I mentioned this in a previous class, but Neil Smith wrote about this in his book, the production of nature on uneven development. And he talks about a seesaw motion of capital, where capital is always accumulating and investing in one area but that means that it's divesting in another area, right? But it's seesaw because at some point you can't get profits here, right? But here it's so low that you can get profits. And so then it sort of changes, right? The seesaw swings in the other direction. He talks about a couple different strata of the working class. First, the badly paid strata, drawing on public health reports. He looks at the poor conditions of food consumption and housing and their susceptibility to illness. Sometimes this motivates public health measures because these conditions could undercut the supply of healthy workers. So it's not out of a concern for the well-being of workers, but it's out of the concern for capital's ability to continue to employ them. Nomads, he's referring to those who originated in agriculture. They were driven off the land and they had to sort of go places. And so they migrate to industrial employment. And when they're not on the march, they camp. We can think about migrant labor in the same way, internationally also, in that, many migrants were driven out of their homes and their homelands as a result of the increasing accumulation of capital there, the imperialistic accumulation of capital there. And so then they have to move around and look for other forms of work. And then he talks about the best paid workers and how industrial crises can also affect even the best paid, the aristocracy of the working class. There's also a bit in here about debt and the importance of, for the working class to withstand these crises, they have to get credit from the capitalist. And this is something that has only intensified in our era, such that debt is really one of the fundamental sort of things structuring, our society as a whole. And then at the end, he talks about the cycles sort of overall. Here then, under our eyes and on a large scale, a process is revealed than which nothing more excellent could be wished for by orthodox political economy for the support of its dogma that misery springs from absolute surplus population and the equilibrium is reestablished by depopulation. So Marx is referring here to depopulation through the plague, through displacement by war, forced emigration, famine, or we can think about pandemics, right? Sometimes wiping out the poorest sectors of the working class is of a benefit to capital because it solves the worst effects of the surplus population problem without impacting economic growth in the slightest. So that's really where he ends off in this. And let's stick around and we can discuss more. For those of you who have to leave, remember that next week we are going to be finishing the book, part 8, chapters 26 through 33. And I think you'll find that these chapters are very easy to read. They're very historical. They're very clearly articulated. And we're going to talk about not only the ways in which capital actually came into being, but also some of the mechanisms that capital still uses in order to reinforce and to expand its rule.